On the morning of October 9th in the year 1856, beneath the ornate wrought-iron balconies of the Montgomery Cotton Exchange, a woman's fate was sealed by a sale, her price, when reckoned by the measures of our present age, a staggering $412,000. The auctioneer's gavel descended 23 times, each resonant blow echoing through the vaulted space, until a profound stillness at last enveloped the assembly. When the transaction was complete, the victorious bidder, his triumph perhaps a bitter draught, disgorged his nausea into a brass spittoon before affixing his signature to the bill of sale with hands that betrayed a profound tremor. No newspaper dared to chronicle the transaction, no ledger endured to cast light upon it. And the woman herself uttered not a solitary syllable throughout the entire proceeding. She stood upon that auction block, her gaze transfixed upon an unseen horizon, wearing an expression that witnesses would later describe as a semblance of a smile, yet one devoid of mirth, more akin to one who watches the inevitable descent of a trap, knowing precisely the moment of its closure. The price eclipsed all prior records in Alabama's wretched commerce of human souls. It surpassed the aggregate worth of 3 thriving plantations. It represented a sum greater than the lifetime's acquisitions of most men present. And yet, 6 different buyers vied for her, with a desperation that teetered on the precipice of madness, driving the price upward in increments that defied all economic rationale, following no logic except the dread certainty that whoever possessed this woman would possess something worth infinitely more than money. What secret could justify such an unfathomable bounty? What knowledge could transform a human being into the most exorbitant chattel ever sold south of the Mason-Dixon line? And why did 3 of the men who bid on her that October morning die under enigmatic circumstances within 18 months, while 2 others vanished from Alabama's soils eternally, forsaking their estates, their kin, their very existences, as though pursued by a specter more fearsome than ruin or infamy? Before we continue with the story that Montgomery strove so desperately to inter, we invite you to accompany us on this odyssey. Join the fellowship of the sealed room, and let the chime of notification herald our discoveries, for the narratives we unearth here are those mighty personages have for generations sought to expunge from the scrolls of history. Share your thoughts below, revealing your vantage point and speculating upon the woman's inscrutable enigma. We forge a fellowship of spirits who decline to let these buried truths remain interred. Now let us return to that October morning when an entity stepped onto Montgomery's auction block, a presence utterly anathema to its grim purpose. Montgomery in 1856 was a city intoxicated by the lucre of cotton and steeped in the delusion of its own invincibility. The Alabama River carried paddle-wheeled behemoths laden with bales destined for textile mills in Manchester and Boston, and the elegant homes along Dexter Avenue housed families whose wealth had been wrung from the rich Delta soil by the toil of souls they held in legal thrall, yet whose spirits they could never truly command. The city's 28,000 residents stratified themselves into customary castes, white and black, free and enslaved, powerful and powerless. Though these divisions were always more precarious than any cared to acknowledge, the Cotton Exchange stood on Commerce Street, a Greek revival edifice, its columns reaching for the solemn grandeur of antiquity, yet ultimately achieving merely the semblance of a stage setting for some grand drama of empire. Inside, the auction floor could comfortably embrace a gathering of 200 men, and on busy days it did, with planters and speculators and merchant brokers alike conducting the transactions that sustained Alabama's burgeoning economy. Here, 3 times each week, human souls exchanged masters. Disposed of alongside the ephemeral promise of cotton futures, the vacant expanse of warehouse space, and the speculative shares of riverboat enterprises. Each commodity negotiable, each life bearing a price, all reduced to mere figures within leather-bound ledgers, tallying gains and losses, yet never conceding the profound moral insolvency that undergirded such transactions. The auctioneer that October morning was a man named Silas Whitmore, 51 years old, whose voice rasped like coarse gravel and whose formidable reputation spoke of relentless efficiency. He had conducted more than 8,000 sales during his career, and he took professional pride in his ability to discern the temper of a crowd, to sense when bidders were reaching their limit, to wrest the utmost value from every transaction. His commission depended on final prices, and he had developed techniques for conjuring competition, even when natural demand seemed insufficient. A calculated pause, a pointed inquiry aimed at a hesitant bidder, a whispered intimation of rival interest. These were the tools of his trade, and he plied them with the unerring precision of a surgeon's blade. The morning had proceeded normally until approximately 10:30, when the side entrance opened and 3 men entered, escorting a woman whose presence immediately and fundamentally transmuted the very essence of the room's atmosphere. The crowd's conversation did not precisely cease, but it shifted in its very timbre, becoming quieter, more cautious, as though everyone felt, in a singular, collective intuition, the imminence of an extraordinary event. She appeared to be somewhere between 30 and 40 years old, though her face bore an elusive quality, rendering precise age estimation a formidable task. Her skin was the hue of river-darkened coffee, and her features suggested a lineage whispered of African, European, and perhaps Creek or Cherokee streams commingled. She stood approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall, a stature notably uncommon for a woman of any provenance in that epoch, and her posture exuded a placid composure, nearly an affront given the stark reality of her plight. She wore a plain gray dress, immaculate yet marked by the ravages of use, and her hair had been pulled back in a style that unveiled a countenance of unsettling intellect. But it was her hands that ignited the initial whispers of bewilderment. They were covered in ink stains, such as accrue upon fingers consecrated to countless hours of script, and her palms bore calluses situated in patterns indicative of wielding a pen, not the rough-hewn toil of the fields or the ceaseless chores of domesticity. For anyone knowledgeable about enslaved labor, these hands narrated an impossible tale. Enslaved people were prescribed by statute from acquiring the arts of literacy in Alabama, and while some owners secretly transgressed this ordinance, they assuredly never suffered their chattel to cultivate such a depth of calluses as bespoke relentless inscription. Silas Whitmore descended from his platform, his professional mien momentarily faltering, revealing a raw, unfeigned uncertainty. He spoke briefly with the 3 escorts, examining documents they produced, and those nearest the front would later report that his countenance traversed a gamut of emotions, from bewilderment to incredulity, and thence to an unmistakable flicker of apprehension. When he returned to his platform, he held a sealed envelope in his left hand, and his right hand quivered ever so slightly as he lifted it to command the assembly's notice. The auction floor subsided into an unwonted stillness with remarkable celerity. Men sensed that something extraordinary was about to happen, and even the most seasoned of speculators leaned forward, their commercial instincts sensing an opportunity whose precise contours remained elusive. "Gentlemen," Whitmore began, his voice bereft of its customary assurance, "we have before us today a lot that necessitates a peculiar introduction. The woman you see has been identified merely as chattel number 47, no name provided, age estimated at 35 years. No recorded history of toil in the fields, domestic employ, nor any recognized artisan's craft." A voice rang out from the middle of the crowd. "Then what's she worth, Whitmore? Why squander our precious morning?" Whitmore's jawline tautened. "The opening bid has been established at $8,000. The silence that followed was utter. $8,000 exceeded what most skilled artisans, be they white or black, free or bound, could earn within a decade's arduous labor. It represented the price of a fully equipped blacksmith's forge, or the services of 2 seasoned carriage drivers, or even sufficient field hands to cultivate 100 acres of cotton. For a single woman with no documented skills, the figure was preposterous. But Silas Whitmore didn't lower the price. Instead, he did something none of the seasoned auction attendees had ever before beheld. He breached the seal of the envelope he bore and commenced to read aloud, his voice receding into a near whisper with each passing sentence, as if he harbored the vain hope that a hushed tone might diminish the profound import of his revelations. "The seller provides the following solemn affidavit, sworn before Judge Harrison Mitchell of Montgomery County on October 4th of this year. The property designated number 47 possesses knowledge of singular value to those engaged in pecuniary transactions, the intricacies of dominion over property, and the delicate edifice of personal repute. Said knowledge has been attested to by direct demonstration before 5 witnesses, whose very names must remain shrouded in secrecy for their own safeguarding. The purchaser will receive, along with standard documentation of sale, a sealed missive elucidating the precise nature and vast scope of this profound wisdom, accompanied by counsel for its judicious application." The crowd's confusion began coagulating into a darker, more ominous apprehension. Men started volleying questions. "What knowledge? What demonstration? What's in the letter?" Whitmore raised his hand for silence, then continued reading, and the words that followed would reverberate as hushed murmurs in Montgomery's drawing rooms for years hence, ever spoken in tones too subdued for the ears of domestic staff. The seller states that the property in question possesses unblemished and absolute recollection of every document, ledger, missive, contract, promissory note, deed, testament, and financial record she has ever perceived. Her memory operates with a fidelity akin to photographic verisimilitude. She can articulate verbatim, page by painstaking page, any text she has seen, regardless of complexity or length. She can reproduce numerical calculations, account balances, and transaction details years after initial observation. This capacity has been tested extensively and found to be without error or limitation. A novel hush descended upon the auction floor, this one pregnant with ramifications instantly grasped by every man assembled. In a commerce founded upon credit's fragile scaffolding, where colossal fortunes poised precariously on mere parchment promises, where deeds of property might be contested, where debts might be conveniently effaced from memory, where last testaments might be impugned, and contracts endlessly reinterpreted, a person with perfect memory of financial documents represented a potency of a caliber that soared beyond the mundane metrics of commercial worth. Whitmore wasn't finished reading. The seller further states that during her long tenure of service within sundry households and commercial emporiums in Montgomery and surrounding counties, the property has been present during the preparation, review, and storage of thousands of documents, a multitude of which their originators presume to be sacrosanct or destined for eternal secrecy. She has perused ledgers of account, intimate correspondences, pecuniary compacts, and other ephemera, whose contents, if disclosed to interested parties, would prove an invaluable trove beyond simple reckoning. Now the ramifications stood starkly revealed, and the auction floor descended into pandemonium. Men were shouting, some voices laced with fury, others with fright, still others with a ravenous eagerness that suggested they were already calculating what they might gain from possessing this perambulating repository of secrets. Others were surging towards the exits, their countenances pallid with alarm, presumably aghast that their own clandestine papers might reside within the labyrinthine confines of this woman's memory. Silas Whitmore tarried until the tumult abated, then articulated the concluding and most disquieting segment of the seller's statement. The property will render full cooperation to her lawful master, furnishing any requested intelligence with exhaustive and unerring precision. She has been groomed to comprehend that her very existence hinges solely upon her utility and her circumspection. The seller guarantees the accuracy of all information she provides and disclaims all accountability for any repercussions stemming from her owner's deployment of such intelligence. The opening bid remains $8,000. Do I now hear the sum of $8,000? For 10 seconds, a profound stasis gripped the assembly. Then a hand rose in the back of the room belonging to a prominent cotton factor, James Deloqua, whose expansive enterprises spanned 4 counties. 8,000, he said, his voice steady. 9,000 came immediately from another bidder, a merchant banker, Thomas Sheridan, the financier of half the plantations nestled within the fertile Black Belt. What followed was unlike any auction Silas Whitmore had ever conducted. The bidding escalated with frightening celerity, propelled not by cold commercial reckoning, but by sheer dread and a ravenous yearning for the formidable power this woman embodied. 10,000, 12,000, 15,000. Men who had come to purchase field hands found themselves competing for something immeasurably more perilous. A human being who harbored within her enough arcana to shatter reputations, beggar entire families, and dismantle claims to property that had seemed inviolable for generations. At $18,000, only 5 bidders remained, and the crowd had divided into 2 groups, those still competing, their faces showing the visceral strain of wagering their entire fiscal destinies upon a solitary acquisition, and those watching with countenances etched with emotions spanning from stark horror to a chilling satisfaction, understanding that whoever won this auction would become the most formidable figure in Montgomery, wielding knowledge capable of being forged into 1,000 instruments of ruin. 20,000, declared a man whose very identity would remain a subject of fervent dispute for years thereafter. He stood near the sidewall, his visage partly veiled by the expansive brim of a planter's hat. His apparel bespoke affluence, yet afforded no hint as to his precise vocation or provenance. His voice possessed an unassailable certitude, the tone of one uttering a conclusive offer they knew to be insurmountable. The 4 remaining competitors looked at each other, performing swift mental computations concerning their lines of credit and available principal. and whether any quantum of potential coercive leverage could warrant such fiscal immolation. One by one they lowered their hands, their faces showing a balm of relief intermingled with what might have been chagrin, or perhaps a profound terror at the precipice from which they had recoiled. Silas Whitmore brought his gavel down with a resounding thud. "Sold to the gentleman by the wall for the considerable sum of $20,000. Please come forward to complete the transaction." The winner moved through the crowd with measured gait, and as he approached the platform, men stepped aside, creating space around him as if his very proximity carried peril. Up close, he appeared to be in his late 40s, his face etched with the marks of one who had endured many hours beneath the open sky, yet whose hands, soft and unmarred, betrayed no personal acquaintance with arduous physical toil. His clothes were expensive, but not ostentatious, the kind of discreet anonymity that men of great means sometimes adopt when seeking to elude unwanted remembrance. The transaction took 90 minutes to complete. Bank drafts necessitated verification. Indentures of ownership required duplication. Witnesses had to be secured for signatures that would solemnize the entire affair under the strictures of Alabama law. During this entire process, the woman designated property number 47 remained impassive on the auction floor, her countenance unwavering, her gaze still fastened upon that unseen locus beyond the throng. Several men tried to speak to her, asking questions about what documents she might have seen, what families she had served, what secrets she might possess. She never responded, never even acknowledged their presence, preserving a silence so profound it bordered on the ethereal. When every parchment had been duly consummated, the buyer produced a key and unlocked the iron manacles that had bound her wrists. The metal fell away, revealing crimson abrasions upon her skin, which she made no gesture to soothe. He handed her a folded shawl, which she arranged over her shoulders with gestures hinting at long-accustomed ritual, then gestured toward the side door. She walked beside him without hesitation, her posture unchanged, and together they vanished into the crisp October morn, leaving behind an assembly that would for hours dissect the spectacle they had just witnessed and ponder its fathomless import. 3 days later, rumors and inquiries began to eddy through Montgomery's commercial district. Men wanted to know the buyer's identity, where he had taken his purchase, what he intended to do with a trove of knowledge capable of dismantling half of Alabama's most esteemed families. The bank that had attested to the veracity of his drafts merely confirmed that the funds were legitimate, drawn on an account registered to a timber concern operating in the state's northern reaches. The company's listed address corresponded to a sawmill that had lain dormant for 2 years. The name on the account, Marcus Webb, was inscribed upon no tax rolls, no property indentures, no mercantile registrations anywhere within the vast expanse of Alabama. The 5 witnesses mentioned in the seller's statement proved untraceable, though courthouse records confirmed that Judge Harrison Mitchell had indeed affixed his seal to a document on October 4th. When a lawyer attempted to examine this document, he discovered it had been placed under judicial seal, inaccessible without a court mandate that no magistrate appeared inclined to grant. The seller's identity persisted as an equal enigma. The 3 men who had escorted the woman to the auction vanished immediately thereafter, their identities never ascertained. But the most disturbing development came from the woman's past itself, because once people began investigating her history, they discovered a revelation that defied all possibility. Over the next several weeks, shards of her narrative surfaced from informants who adamantly insisted upon anonymity, each piece adding to a tapestry of her past, each thread adding to its disquieting complexity. Her name, according to those who had known her before the auction, was Delilah, though whether this was a natal name or an appellation bestowed by her masters remained shrouded in ambiguity. She had belonged to at least 7 different households during her life, transferred from master to master through sales, bequests, and the settling of debts, a pattern common enough for enslaved people whose very being was deemed a transferable chattel. But what made Delilah's course of life uncommon was the specific type of household that repeatedly acquired her. She had spent time in the home of Montgomery's foremost legal luminary, where she worked as a household servant, but was often a quiet presence within his chambers during confidential client consultations and the drafting of legal instruments. She had belonged to a cotton factor who meticulously maintained ledgers detailing credit advanced to scores of planters, and she had been in the room when these books were reviewed and updated. She had served in the household of a judge whose private library housed ancient land deeds and surveys of estates dating back to Alabama's very territorial genesis, documents that solidified dominion over thousands of acres. She had worked for a merchant banker who oversaw the complex machinery of loans and mortgages, and she had been present during negotiations where men mortgaged their very plantations as collateral against gambling debts they held no genuine hope of ever settling. In each household, she had been valued for qualities that seemed of no particular note at the time. She was quiet, unobtrusive, adept at household chores, and possessed of a peculiar stillness that rendered her effortlessly overlooked by her masters. People would discuss confidential matters in her presence, review private documents while she cleaned the room, negotiate sensitive agreements while she served tea, never once conceiving that her profound quietude might veil keen observation rather than simple ignorance. After all, she was illiterate, or so their presumptions asserted. Enslaved people were not instructed in the art of reading. They could scarcely fathom the intricate import of contractual legalese, the precise demarcation of property lines, or the delicate equilibrium of account ledgers that dictated dominion and indebtedness. Yet Delilah possessed this forbidden gift of literacy. She had, by some inscrutable means, taught herself, perhaps by observing the tutelage imparted to white children in households where she worked, perhaps through clandestine access to volumes left negligently within her grasp, perhaps through the surreptitious aid of one who, defying Alabama's statutes, facilitated an enslaved person's acquisition of proscribed knowledge. And she possessed a faculty beyond mere literacy, one neither taught nor learned, but rather encountered with chilling revelation by those who bore witness to it. Her memory operated with an exactitude that defied the very strictures of natural law. The first individual to meticulously chronicle this extraordinary faculty was a plantation owner named Richard Thornhill, who had purchased Delilah in 1853 when she was approximately 30 years old. Thornhill operated a modest-sized cotton plantation in Lowndes County, and he bought Delilah to work as a house servant, drawn by whispered commendations of her reliability and minimal need for oversight. She worked in his household for 8 months, without blemish or stir, discharging her duties with quiet competence, preserving the same placid demeanor that had characterized her service in previous households. Then one evening in March of 1854, Thornhill made a startling discovery that would, 2.5 years thence, ultimately herald Delilah's fateful appearance upon Montgomery's grim auction block. He had been poring over his ledgers of account within his study, striving to reconcile a troubling discrepancy in his cotton sales from the preceding season. The figures refused to align with his recollection, hinting either at an oversight in his meticulous bookkeeping or perhaps a clandestine embezzlement by his factor in Mobile. He labored for hours, sifting through correspondence and receipts, his frustration mounting, until Delilah entered the chamber to attend to his tea service. Without thinking, he uttered an inquiry he would rue for the remainder of his days. "Where did I put that letter from Mobile? The one about the October cotton shipment?" Delilah paused, her hands still holding the tea tray, and for the first time in 8 months she articulated more than a mere monosyllabic assent or dissent. "The letter is in the drawer of your desk, third from the top, filed behind correspondence from your brother. It arrived on October 19th. Your factor had written that he had transacted 17 bales at 9 cents per pound, yielding total proceeds of $84.60, from which, after deducting his 6% commission, a balance of $792.98 remained, to be duly credited to your ledger." Thornhill stared at her, his bewilderment slowly yielding to a dawning comprehension, then to a chill apprehension. The letter she described was from 4 months earlier. She had been in the room when he read it once, but only once, and he had never discussed its contents with anyone. Yet she had just recounted precise pecuniary details with an unerring fidelity that mirrored the letter exactly, for he found the document where she said it would be, and confirmed every numeral she had uttered. Over the following weeks, Thornhill subjected her to ceaseless trials, interrogating her about documents to which she had been privy, correspondences he had perused in her presence, ledgers she might have fleetingly observed whilst tending his study. Each successive trial yielded an identical outcome. She could recite pages of text word for word. She could reproduce columns of numbers with perfect accuracy. She could describe documents she had seen once, months, or even years earlier, with a richness of detail that surpassed his own recollection of the very same materials. Thornhill instantly grasped the profound import of his possession. Delilah wasn't just a house servant with an unusual memory. She was a living archive of every document she had ever cast her gaze upon. And given her history of service in households and businesses across Montgomery, she potentially contained enough financial information to reconfigure the entire fiscal panorama of central Alabama. She knew who held debt to whom and in what measure. She knew which property deeds contained imperfections ripe for exploitation. She knew which men had affixed their hand to compacts they later disavowed, which ledgers harbored spurious entries, which great fortunes were poised upon paper assertions that would inevitably crumble under judicial inquest. Richard Thornhill was not a man of pronounced moral rectitude, yet he harbored sufficient foresight to discern peril when it manifested itself. He understood that owning Delilah vested him with immense power, yet simultaneously rendered him a marked man. Every person whose secrets she held would have compelling cause to either procure her or utterly expunge her. Every competitor who learned about her capabilities would seek to purchase her without heed to pecuniary sum. And if word spread too widely, some might decide the safest solution was simply to kill her, obliterating the archive ere its formidable contents could be transformed into instruments of destruction. Thornhill maintained Delilah's remarkable faculties as a closely guarded secret for nigh upon a year, employing her with discernment to secure an edge in his mercantile dealings. When he needed to recall specific contract terms during a dispute, he would privately confer with her, then proffer the intelligence as if drawn from his own recollection or from documents he had personally scrutinized. When questions arose about property boundaries, he would have Delilah describe survey records she had seen years earlier, affording him potent leverage in the delicate dance of settlement negotiations. He made a considerable fortune through these hushed consultations, a sum sufficient to substantially augment his plantation domains. But Thornhill also began indulging more deeply in spirits, finding less solace in slumber, and exhibiting a burgeoning paranoia regarding visitors to his estate. He started confining Delilah to a locked storeroom whenever guests graced his plantation, fearing that too keen an observation might reveal her true, immeasurable worth. He fired 3 overseers in 6 months, convinced they were spying on him or planning to steal his property. His wife began complaining to relatives that Richard was becoming unhinged. Consumed by some enigma, he stubbornly refused to divulge. In August of 1855, Thornhill made the fateful decision that would irrevocably seal his destiny. He took Delilah to Montgomery and presented a proposition to several esteemed gentlemen. He would lease them ingress to her extraordinary memory for considerable sums, allowing them to consult her about documents and records relevant to their business interests. He believed this arrangement would disperse the inherent peril, thereby rendering him less a singular target, while still reaping profit from his peculiar possession. Yet the proposal wrought precisely the inverse effect. Once people understood what Delilah represented, they no longer sought mere access. They coveted absolute ownership, yearning to command her formidable knowledge entirely, to preclude any rival from wielding her memory as a weapon against them. Within weeks, Thornhill began receiving offers to purchase Delilah, some accompanied by thinly veiled menaces about what might happen if he refused to sell. His plantation suffered 2 separate incursions by thieves in September. His cotton warehouse suffered a conflagration of dubious origin in October. In November, an unseen assailant discharged a firearm at him from the sheltering embrace of the tree line as he rode across his estate, the bullet's swift passage so near that he felt the very whisper of displaced air upon his skin. Richard Thornhill succumbed to the inexorable pressure. In December of 1855, he sold Delilah to an intermediary for $12,000, a sum that should have signified a grand triumph, yet instead felt like a desperate flight from a snare of his own unwitting construction. He took his wife and children and left Alabama within a month, relocating to Kentucky, where he purchased a small tobacco farm and dwelt in quiet obscurity beneath an assumed name, until his passing from pneumonia in the year 1862. He never publicly uttered Delilah's name, nor divulged the nature of her extraordinary faculties, and this silence was rigorously upheld by his kin, even when emancipation rendered such disclosures legally benign. The intermediary, a solicitor named Samuel Crawford, who acquired Delilah from Thornhill, plied a trade specializing in the discreet services sought by affluent families besieged by the specter of scandal. Crawford apprehended that Delilah represented something unprecedented, a chattel whose worth resided not in toil, but in knowledge, a truth of such potency that its public utterance would invariably extinguish its very value. For 9 months he consulted with various parties, pondering her fate, how to extract maximum value while navigating the colossal perils her awareness presented. Samuel Crawford's protracted deliberations converged upon a conclusion destined to unleash catastrophe upon all entwined within its web. Instead of consigning Delilah to a lone purchaser who might hoard her singular knowledge, he resolved to parade her publicly, stirring a tempest of competition that would elevate her price to unparalleled heights, while simultaneously ensuring many men of influence grasped the precise nature of the ware on offer. The auction, then, became both transaction and harbinger, revealing that secrets were not merely things of hushed whispers, but commodities to be bought, that no private parchment retained its sanctity if glimpsed by an unwelcome eye, that the very edifice of credit, debt, and claims to property throughout Alabama was predicated upon a sanctity of confidence now poised to crumble. Crawford spent weeks orchestrating the event, dispatching clandestine messages to men whose mercantile interests made them likely contenders, arranging for Judge Mitchell to notarize the seller's statement, thereby ensuring every aspect would be legal and binding under Alabama law. He apprehended that the sale would birth pandemonium, yet pandemonium, he mused, could be made to yield fortunes for one cunningly placed to seize its wild currents. What eluded Crawford's foresight was the chilling truth. Some secrets are too perilous to be bartered. Some knowledge bears a gravitas that annihilates all who dare embrace it. The men vying for Delilah's possession did not seek a chattel for gain, but rather sought to forestall others from seizing a weapon capable of their ruin. The man who purchased Delilah for $20,000 bore the name Marcus Webb. That much, at least, rang true, though all else concerning him was a meticulously crafted fabrication. He was no timber magnate, nor did he conduct any enterprise in northern Alabama. He was a being far more menacing, a seasoned blackmailer who, for 15 years, had woven a labyrinthine web of informants and compromised souls across the South, amassing secrets with the same voracious zeal with which others gathered land or bales of cotton. For much of his career, he had hunted for a soul like Delilah. Webb understood immediately the profound significance of Crawford's auction. It was not merely the sale of an unusually valuable piece of property, it was a stark revelation. Perfect memory walked among them, a living archive, bearing truths that powerful men had believed safely interred within private epistles and clasped ledgers. And Webb grasped something else that Crawford, in his avarice, had failed to perceive. The auction itself proved Delilah's death knell. For once her extraordinary contents were laid bare to the world. She became a peril too profound to suffer her continued existence. Webb's acquisition was no mere investment. It was an act of salvage, though whether he purposed to save Delilah herself or merely the trove of secrets she harbored remained cloaked in ambiguity even from his own understanding. He spirited her away from Montgomery within hours of the auction's conclusion, journeying northward in a hired conveyance toward the Tennessee frontier, pressing on with an urgency sufficient to outpace any potential pursuer. He had arranged a temporary refuge, a farmhouse in Limestone County, owned by an associate who asked no questions and kept no records of visitors. They arrived after dark on October 10th. Webb had uttered almost nothing during the journey, and Delilah, for her part, had preserved her customary silence, her unsettling composure, so strikingly akin to that she had worn upon the auction block, unwavering as she sat opposite him in the carriage. But once they were inside the farmhouse, lamps lit and the door secured, Webb finally addressed her directly, addressing her as a sentient being, not a chattel, a distinction unheard since the final stroke of the transaction. "You understand what's about to happen," he stated, his words not a question. Delilah met his gaze, her eyes devoid of fear, of hope, of any discernible emotion. A single nod was her reply. "The men who bid against me will not accept this outcome," Webb continued. "Some of them carry secrets you've memorized, and they cannot allow you to exist as someone else's property. They will come for you. Some will offer money, some will offer threats. Some will merely seek to extinguish you, and any who dare shield you. You have become the most perilous soul in all of Alabama." Delilah spoke for the first time since the auction, her voice quiet but perfectly clear. "I have always been Alabama's most dangerous person. They simply remained oblivious until this very day." Webb stared at her, recalibrating his understanding. He had presumed her a mere casualty of fate, a soul whose extraordinary gifts had ensnared her in circumstances beyond her governance. Yet her measured words betrayed a different truth, a deliberation suggesting choice, not happenstance, strategy, not ill fortune. "You wanted this," he said slowly. "You wanted to be sold publicly. You wanted everyone to know what you can do." Delilah then offered a smile, an expression that auction witnesses had struggled to articulate. It bore the semblance of satisfaction, yet carried the chill sensation of a blade parting flesh between ribs. "Knowledge requires payment," she declared. "For 15 years they have plundered my essence, wielding my memory to arbitrate their quarrels, liquidate their debts, corroborate their claims to property. They regarded me as an instrument, to be summoned at their whim and discarded when no longer expedient. Thus, I resolved to reveal my true nature, not a mere implement, but a weapon. And now, they shall render payment for every secret I have amassed." Webb felt something cold settle in his chest. "What price?" Delilah moved to the window, gazing into the profound darkness that veiled any unseen eyes already drawing their vigil around the farmhouse. "They imagine that owning me grants them dominion over the secrets I hold, but knowledge holds no such dominion. Once men comprehend that secrets may be flawlessly recalled, once they grasp that no private script retains its privacy if an unwelcome gaze falls upon it, then trust itself shatters into irreparable fragments. How does a planter negotiate with his factor if he knows their conversation might be recorded in someone's flawless memory? How does a banker extend credit if he worries his account books might be memorized by a servant present in the room? How do any of them continue operating in a world where privacy is revealed to be an illusion?" She turned back to face Webb, and her expression held something that might have been satisfaction, or might have been grief. "I am no weapon to be aimed at your adversaries. I am a weapon already detonated. The ruin is wrought. The auction accomplished its design. Now we merely witness the ensuing collapse." Over the following weeks, Marcus Webb discovered that Delilah had been absolutely correct. The auction's aftermath resonated through Montgomery's commercial tapestry, a tremor spreading like cracks spiderwebbing through glass under relentless pressure. Men who had bid on Delilah but lost began demanding investigations into what secrets she might possess about their business rivals. Those who hadn't bid started wondering what information she held about them, what documents she might have observed during her years of service in prominent households. Paranoia, a contagion far swifter than yellow fever, spread its insidious tendrils. Attorneys who had once freely discussed client confidences before household servants now fretted over unseen ears. Bankers hastened to sequester their ledgers in fortified strongholds, as if such acts could expunge the damning truth that these very books had lain open before those they had long deemed mere furnishings. Planters began to dispute property deeds and financial obligations, asserting that their rivals had somehow gained illicit access to privileged knowledge, though the precise mechanism of such acquisition remained shrouded in their baffled silence. 3 weeks after the auction, James Delacroix, the cotton factor who had bid $8,000, was found dead in his Commerce Street office. The coroner pronounced his demise a suicide by gunshot, noting the fatal instrument clutched in Delacroix's hand and the missive upon his desk detailing his decision. The letter spoke of financial ruin and personal despondency, yet those who perused it, his intimates, observed a tremor in Delacroix's script as though penned beneath the weight of coercion. His account books, which should have contained records of credit extended to dozens of planters, had been removed from the office and were never recovered. In November, Thomas Sheridan, the merchant banker who had bid $9,000, fled Montgomery under the cloak of darkness, abandoning a wife and 3 children who claimed utter ignorance of his destination or motives for departure. His bank soon uncovered irregularities in several loan accounts, suggesting years of embezzlement, yet the evidence seemed too conveniently precise, too flawlessly documented, as if someone had meticulously arranged these discoveries specifically to drive Sheridan into exile. The third death arrived in December. A planter named William Crane, who had bid to $12,000 before withdrawing, was killed when his carriage overturned on a road he had traveled safely for 20 years. The accident occurred at night, on a curve where someone had strategically weakened the road surface, though no inquiry could ascertain the perpetrator or motive. Crane's widow found among his effects a letter he had apparently been drafting before his death, describing his conviction that he was under surveillance, that men who had participated in the auction were being targeted, and that his only safety lay in abandoning Alabama entirely. He never finished the letter. But the most disturbing development stemmed from something that did not happen. Marcus Webb and Delilah vanished completely. No one could locate them, no one could trace their movements. It was as though the earth had opened and swallowed them both, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a growing conviction that the auction had unleashed something uncontrollable, untamable. Rumors multiplied with the speed that characterizes frightened communities. Some claimed Webb had taken Delilah north, vending her secrets to politicians in Washington who sought leverage over Southern congressmen. Others insisted he had murdered her immediately after the purchase, understanding she was too perilous to be kept alive, her knowledge a liability outweighing any potential profit. A particularly persistent story suggested Delilah had killed Webb within days of the auction, then assumed a new identity and melted into the free black communities of northern cities, carrying her archive of secrets to a place beyond the reach of Alabama's laws. The truth, when it finally unfurled itself years hence, eclipsed the darkest rumors, for it laid bare a game played by Delilah across a canvas far vaster than any had conceived. The auction, a mere gambit in a strategy spanning decades, the payment knowledge demanded, a sum far exceeding the $20,000 Marcus Webb had offered. In 1864, amidst the chaos of Sherman's relentless advance toward Atlanta, a Union officer named Colonel Benjamin Hastings received an unusual visitor at his headquarters. A woman of mixed race, approximately 45 years old, appeared at his camp requesting an interview. She bore documents declaring her a free woman, papers whose legitimacy seemed plausible, yet hinted at the subtle artistry of forgery, occupying that liminal realm between lawful and illicit. The woman identified herself as Delilah Webb and claimed to possess information invaluable to Union intelligence. She recounted having spent years in Montgomery, Alabama, laboring in households and businesses where Confederate officers and government officials had discussed strategy, troop movements, supply lines, and financial arrangements with European bankers who provided credit to sustain the rebellion. She asserted her ability to recall these conversations perfectly, word for word, and to reproduce documents she had observed detailing the Confederacy's financial vulnerabilities and strategic weaknesses. Colonel Hastings was initially skeptical, but he agreed to test her claims. He presented her with a captured Confederate dispatch, allowed her to read it once, then requested its reproduction. She recited the entire document from memory, including intricate details about troop positions and supply requisitions, without a single error. Hastings summoned other officers who questioned her on Alabama geography, prominent families, and business relationships potentially useful for intelligence. Her replies evinced a breadth of knowledge seemingly unattainable for one of her station and sex, yet every detail she imparted found corroboration in intelligence gleaned from disparate sources. Hastings made a decision that would alter the course of several military campaigns. He brought Delilah to Washington, introduced her to senior intelligence officers, and arranged for her systematic debriefing on everything she had observed during her years in Montgomery. The information she provided proved devastatingly accurate. She described cotton shipments being diverted through Mexico to European buyers, furnishing the Union Navy with specific routes and timings that allowed them to intercept critical Confederate revenue. She detailed conversations between Alabama politicians and British textile manufacturers, revealing which families were most vulnerable to financial pressure. She identified Confederate sympathizers operating in border states, individuals whose loyalties remained secret but whose correspondence she had memorized while serving in households where such letters were reviewed. The intelligence Delilah provided contributed directly to Union victories that shortened the war by an estimated 6 months, saving thousands of lives while simultaneously dismantling the economic foundation that had sustained the Confederacy's military operations. And she accomplished all of this while maintaining the same unsettling composure she had displayed on the Montgomery auction block 8 years earlier, providing information with mechanical precision, never showing emotion, never revealing whether she took satisfaction from the devastation her knowledge was causing to the families that had owned her. When the war ended, Delilah disappeared again. The Union Army had no further use for her, and she possessed enough money, saved from her intelligence work, to purchase genuine freedom documents and establish herself anywhere she chose. Some records suggest she lived in Philadelphia for several years. Others place her in Boston or New York. A few fragmentary sources claim she traveled to Canada where she worked as a tutor, teaching reading and writing to children of formerly enslaved families. Though whether this particular detail is accurate remains uncertain, the most complete account of Delilah's later life comes from an unexpected source, a private journal kept by Margaret Holloway, the same historian who investigated the Richmond Exchange sale. In 1893, while researching enslaved people's contributions to Union intelligence operations, Holloway discovered references to a woman matching Delilah's description who had provided information to Colonel Hastings. This led her to Montgomery, where she spent 3 months examining what remained of courthouse records and conducting interviews with elderly residents who remembered the October 1856 auction. Most refused to speak about it, even 37 years after the event, even decades after emancipation had made such conversations legally safe. People treated the auction as something shameful that decent society should never acknowledge. But Holloway was persistent, and eventually she found a source willing to talk. An elderly black woman named Sarah Mitchell, who had worked as a seamstress in Montgomery during the antebellum period and had known Delilah personally. Sarah was 71 years old when Holloway interviewed her in November of 1893. Her memory remained sharp, and she spoke with the careful precision of someone who had spent a lifetime weighing her words, understanding that speaking truth as a black woman in Alabama carried risks that never entirely disappeared, regardless of what laws claimed. Delilah wasn't her real name, Sarah explained. Her mother named her Dinah after someone in the Bible, but owners kept changing it depending on what they thought sounded appropriate. She stopped caring what they called her after a while, said names were just another thing white people took from you, so why get attached to anything you couldn't keep? Holloway asked how Delilah had learned to read, where she had acquired the education that made her memory so dangerous. Sarah's expression grew cautious, but after a moment she continued. There was a white woman in Montgomery, a Quaker from Pennsylvania, who married a merchant here. She believed slavery was evil, and she did something about it, even though it was illegal. She taught reading to enslaved people secretly, usually at night, in the back room of a shop her husband owned. Delilah went to those lessons for nearly 2 years, starting when she was maybe 13 or 14. Learned to read, learned to write, learned arithmetic and geography and history. The Quaker woman said Delilah was the most brilliant student she'd ever taught, white or black. Said her memory was like nothing she'd encountered, that Delilah could read something once and recite it perfectly weeks later. What happened to the Quaker woman? Holloway asked. Sarah's face hardened. Someone informed on her in 1843. She was arrested, tried for violating Alabama's education laws, and sentenced to 6 months in jail. Her husband divorced her while she was imprisoned, took their children north, and never came back. She died of fever in that jail 3 weeks before her sentence would have ended. They buried her in the paupers' cemetery outside town, didn't even mark the grave properly. But before she died, she got a message to Delilah. Told her to use what she'd learned to make the knowledge worth something, to make them pay for what they'd stolen. And Delilah did, Holloway said quietly. Sarah nodded. Oh yes, Delilah did exactly that. She spent the next 13 years positioning herself, getting sold to specific households, making herself useful enough that owners would keep her around, but forgettable enough that they'd discuss private matters in her presence. She memorized everything, every document, every spoken word, every secret people presumed safe, for they had never once conceived that an enslaved woman might be listening, comprehending, and remembering with flawless precision. But she didn't use that knowledge immediately. She waited, built up her archive year after year, letting people become comfortable with her presence, collecting more and more information until she possessed enough secrets to destroy dozens of prominent families simultaneously. And then, she orchestrated her own public sale, collaborating with Crawford, the solicitor, to ensure every soul understood the precise nature of the wares. She desired their terror. She yearned for them to grasp that their cherished privacy had ever been a chimera, that every patronizing assumption of enslaved people's ignorance or incapacity was but a comfort they whispered to themselves in the dark of night. Holloway leaned forward, her academic training momentarily overwhelmed by the implications of what she was hearing. The auction was a calculated design. She had orchestrated her own sale thus. Sarah's smile was grim. Delilah had plotted every detail. She foresaw the ensuing pandemonium, the panic of men, the deaths of some, the flight of others. She knew the bedrock of trust between planters, factors, and bankers would fissure and crumble once the truth of perfect memory became manifest. And she knew the war was an inexorable tide, even as most white souls remained willfully blind. She had meticulously positioned herself to be indispensable to the victorious faction. The truest retribution, Sarah resumed, her voice sinking to a hushed murmur, was not wrought during the crucible of war, but in its wake. When Delilah at last tasted freedom, a liberation both genuine and lawful, she started writing letters, sent them to families across Alabama, people whose secrets she'd memorized years earlier. The letters were polite, carefully worded, but the message was clear. She remembered all. She could furnish proof of debts conveniently effaced from memory, of property transfers never duly recorded, of agreements that would, if unearthed, expose them to the full censure of the law. She didn't explicitly demand money. She merely reminded them that she existed, that her memory existed, and that memory doesn't die just because the war ended. Some families rendered payment to her, Holloway observed, a realization dawning in her mind. Sarah nodded. Aye, they paid her, regular sums, quarterly or yearly, a costly silence purchased over the transgressions of their forefathers and fathers. Not all of them mind. Some refused, believing they could disregard a black woman's claims, regardless of her knowledge. For those who refused, misfortunes oft befell, property deeds successfully impugned in courts of law, business partnerships fractured as ancient disputes resurfaced, perfectly documented, reputations shattered when missives appeared in public prints recounting transactions sworn never to have transpired. Delilah lived well in her later years, very well by anyone's standards, owned property in 3 different cities, dressed in clothes that would have been appropriate for a wealthy white woman, traveled wherever she pleased. Some people whispered she was sustained by a patron, a white man who had taken her as his paramour, but those who truly knew her grasped the stark truth. She forged her own prosperity through the meticulous leverage of knowledge amassed across decades, during which she was deemed mere furniture, while men freely discussed affairs they believed would fade into oblivion. Margaret Holloway tried to locate Delilah after her conversation with Sarah Mitchell. She sent letters to addresses in Philadelphia, Boston, and New York, where records suggested a woman matching Delilah's description might have lived. None of the letters received responses. She examined property records, bank accounts, business registrations, searching for any trace of the woman who had sold for $20,000 and then vanished into freedom with enough secrets to sustain her for a lifetime. The search produced only fragments, hints of presence without confirmation. A property deed in Philadelphia registered to a Dinah Webb in 1872. A bank account in Boston belonging to someone with the initials D.W. who made regular deposits from 1868 through 1889. A mention in a newspaper society column from 1885 describing a well-dressed colored woman who attended an abolitionist meeting and contributed generously when donations were requested. But Holloway never found Delilah herself, and eventually she abandoned the search. In her private journal, she wrote that perhaps Delilah's greatest triumph was her disappearance, the way she became impossible to track once she gained control over her own story. For 15 years, people had watched her, monitored her movements, treated her presence as something they owned. Once free, she made herself invisible except when she chose revelation, appearing only to deliver reminders that memory persists and debts eventually come due, regardless of what legal structures claim to erase them. The last confirmed reference to Delilah appears in an 1897 letter discovered in the archives of the Freedmen's Bureau. The letter, unsigned but written in elegant handwriting that analysis suggests belonged to an educated woman of advanced age, describes the experience of being sold at auction and the strategies necessary for survival when you possess knowledge that others fear. The writer never identifies herself by name, but several details match what is known about Delilah's life with a precision that suggests either she wrote this letter herself or someone very familiar with her story composed it on her behalf. The letter's final paragraph contains words that have been quoted in dozens of historical studies since its discovery, because they capture something essential about resistance and memory and the long arc of justice that often moves too slowly for those trapped in its machinery. They believed they owned me, the letter states. They believed that purchasing my body gave them rights to what my mind contained. But memory cannot be owned. Knowledge cannot be chained. I carried their secrets through decades of bondage, and when freedom finally came, those secrets became currency. I spent deliberately, carefully, extracting payment for every humiliation, every moment of being treated as less than human. Some call this revenge. I call it accounting. They kept ledgers tracking what they stole from me and millions like me. I simply kept better records, and I collected the debt they insisted didn't exist. Whether Delilah wrote these words or someone else did, they represent a truth that extends far beyond one woman's extraordinary memory. Throughout the history of American slavery, enslaved people accumulated knowledge about their owners' families, their owners' business dealings and personal failings. They observed everything while being treated as though they observed nothing. They understood conversations conducted in their presence as though their comprehension didn't matter. And sometimes, rarely but powerfully, they used that knowledge to create space for resistance. to extract small victories from impossible circumstances, to demonstrate that the system designed to crush them contained weaknesses that careful observation could exploit. Delilah's story represents an extreme example of this dynamic because her memory operated at a level that seems almost supernatural. But the principle she embodied exists throughout the historical record, visible in countless smaller moments where enslaved people leveraged information to protect themselves, to help others, to create cracks in structures that appeared unbreakable. Knowledge was one of the few resources that couldn't be entirely controlled, one of the few forms of power that surveillance couldn't eliminate, because you can watch a person without ever knowing what they understand about what they're seeing. The auction on October 9, 1856, was ultimately about this uncomfortable truth. When Montgomery's elite gathered to bid on property number 47, they weren't just purchasing one unusually valuable enslaved woman. They were confronting the revelation that their power had always been more fragile than they believed, that the people they owned had been watching them just as carefully as they watched those they enslaved, and that memory could be a weapon that waited years or decades before being deployed with devastating effect. 3 of the men who bid on Delilah died within 18 months. 2 fled Alabama forever. The survivors spent the rest of their lives wondering what she remembered about them, what secrets she might hold, what price she might eventually demand. The auction destroyed trust between planters and factors, between bankers and clients, between anyone whose business depended on confidentiality and anyone who might have observed their confidential dealings. The economic disruption this caused contributed to Alabama's vulnerability when war came, because credit networks had already been damaged by paranoia about who knew what and who might reveal it. And Delilah walked away free eventually, carrying an archive of secrets that sustained her for the rest of her life, extracting payment from people who insisted they owed nothing, demonstrating that knowledge does indeed require payment beyond gold, and the debt compounds with interest until someone finally settles the account. Such stories force us to confront uncomfortable questions about power, memory, and resistance. They reveal that the people history tried to erase were often the ones watching most carefully, remembering most accurately, and waiting most patiently for the moment when their knowledge could be transformed into something more powerful than any auction price could represent. The Montgomery Cotton Exchange building where Delilah stood on that October morning was demolished in 1931 to make way for a department store. No historical marker commemorates what occurred there. No monument acknowledges the woman who sold for more than any enslaved person in Alabama history. The auction records, if they still exist, remain buried in courthouse archives that few researchers bother to examine. But memory persists even when monuments don't. Stories survive even when official history tries to bury them. And sometimes, by listening keenly to the lacunae in historical records, to the deliberate voids where pages were torn from ledgers or documents sealed away for their perilous truths, one may discern the echoes of souls like Delilah, who refused to suffer the theft of their knowledge without ultimately exacting its due. She told them from the beginning, knowledge requires payment beyond gold. They simply didn't understand that she wasn't explaining what they would pay to acquire her knowledge. She was explaining what they would pay for having stolen it in the first place, and that bill came due eventually with interest, collected by the very woman they believed their chattel, yet who, in every moment of her subjugation, prepared for the reckoning that freedom would at last permit her to exact. What do you think about Delilah's story? Was she justified in using the secrets she collected to extract payment from families who had owned her? How should we remember people who resisted oppression using the only weapons available to them, even when those weapons were information others believed should remain buried? If you found this investigation as haunting as we did, consider sharing this video with someone who appreciates historical truths that challenge comfortable narratives. If you want to go deeper, explore other investigations into the buried secrets of American history, the stories that institutions spent generations trying to erase, but that refused to stay silent.